Hey everybody. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about chapter 11. So we're going to talk about the family. Now, I'm going to add in quite a bit because there was several key family dynamics that were missing, just completely wholeheartedly missing. The mention of LGBTQ plus families was very, very limited, and the mention of chosen families was just tragic. So we're going to talk about a wide variety of things, including topics of violence. So, here is your warning that if you need to walk away or need the minutes from what part to what part are talking about interpersonal violence, sexual violence, etc. Now, we did already talk about rape in another module. So I'm not going to get into specifically a great deal of that. However, child abuse, incest, there's also talk about interpersonal violence and domestic violence in here. So I do want to give you a heads up on that as well. And we're going to talk about the movements that particularly work towards the eradication of sexual violence in this particular country. And some of them work more globally as well. All right, so let's get to it. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk about the history and theory first. And I put in here a wide variety of historical pictures because one of the first myths I kind of want to touch base on is the fact that LGBTQ plus families have always been around. For as long as there is written and documented history, there's also written and documented history of these persons. So this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that has just come out of the woodwork. This is just something that, as societal, depending on where societal inclusion and acceptance is, will depend on when and how visible these particular groups are. And that's with any marginalized group, right? You're going to see in times where invisibility is strong, you're also going to see a lot of resistance or resilience, artwork, photography, writing, films, etc. And that's because, again, for as long as time in history, these groups don't just disappear. They're not a part of culture. They just might not be at the forefront of the conversation, or they might not be allowed to be visible for safety reasons, for a wide variety of reasons. But that doesn't make them not exist. And so, in order to kind of continue to fulfill a history that is not white, male dominant, and perpetuating myths of times where certain kinds of identities did not exist, I am going to intentionally talk about these groups. We're going to continuously make sure that these are inclusive and part of the conversation. All right. So in the beginning of history, let me go back. In the beginning of where your textbook started the history, it's really talked about how family was kind of this sacred idea. It was tied to reproduction. It was tied less about money, and marriage was more about law and legitimacy of the family, right? So if you were married, then whatever particular children came out of that were legitimately and legally bound to those parents. And this, again, was long before genetic testing or things of that nature came about. But marriage and family creation was really linked a lot to military, to religious institutions. It was built on this dynamic of creating society, creating this link between religious ideologies and also creating this link to particularly legal citizenship, societal like participation, right? So marriage was specifically a levelizing factor. It was also something that could gain you status depending on if you married someone of a status higher than yours, or depending on if you married someone a status lower than yours, it could also lessen your standing depending. It was, let me be really frank, marriage for the vast majority of time and space that it has been a part of. And this is one of those things that is almost part of every single human societal group, no matter the time or space. Marriage has historically not had anything to do with love. All right. So primarily marriage function in society was to legally or to societally bind people together for whatever particular purposes, whether it be, again, like in the US, it was for legal. It was also for um, family creation so that we knew whose children they were. It was also for the ability to hand down property if you were white and male. um, it was also linked to, um, again, religious ideologies. All right. But this had far less to do with love in any capacity. That is a very, very recent in modern history notion. Um, and so we'll talk more about that. All right. So the traditional family narrative really stems out of kind of in its links to the 1950s era, really comes out of this idea of this nuclear family being a mother, breadwinning father, a stay-at-home mom, and a couple of kids. Now, let me be real frank. For many people of lower socioeconomic status and or many people of color, the traditional family was never a historical option, right? Because it was always required more than one income. And also, individuals, especially women within these groups, traditionally were the ones who would help or were doing domestic labor for those who could afford someone to do it, right? So those in the higher status might not have somebody that cleans their house, or in the lower status might not have somebody that cleans their house, but maybe the one cleaning the house is somebody who does have those means. Okay. And then you also have the deviant family or the societal problem or panic. And that comes down to a wide variety of different variations depending on the time and space, right? So single parenthoods, or especially single moms, um, were looked at as deviant. Widowed women, in particular, historic times with children, was seen as deviant. LGBTQ plus families are still seen as deviant in most locales. Um, uh, Depending on the time period, you're going to have interracial marriages that are going to be looked at as deviant. So really, if you belong to any marginalized group, you still have deviance in marrying someone with disability. Um, what else? Really, if you are part of a marginalized group at some point or still currently, um, the idea of marriage to you and or marriage in between people, marginalized people, are considered deviant or were at some point probably considered deviant. And that's for a variety of reasons, whether it's the asexuality nature that you put on disabled people. So you can marry somebody that you've labeled as childlike or deviant or sexually um, non-inclusive, right? Um, However, to that person, that's probably not the way they live their life. And so, whether society views this or not, their partner probably doesn't. Um, Again, even marrying for money at one point was a deviant family. And so, no matter where it was on the political spectrum at the time, if you were generally a marginalized person or still are a marginalized person, there's going to be some some version of marriage that is going to be considered deviant when it comes to you, which sucks and it's dumb, but that's part of the way in which society regulates behavior. All right. So concerns about the book, just overall, I wanted to get into that a little bit before we started really hammering down into some of these topics. The language in the book can be problematic at times, especially when it comes to interpersonal violence or any kind of violence. We talked about this a lot in the violence chapter when we talk about rape and murder, but it's equally problematic when it talks about domestic violence and incest and child abuse. So, for that reason, um, if you are concerned or you have questions about the language that comes up in this particular chapters, please don't hesitate to reach out. More than likely, I've also flagged that language, and I want to make sure that we are having conversations about that because it's important. There's also some false assumptions that are built into this particular couple of chapters, and that's just due to a wide variety of misnomers that have been in past sociological research that have further marginalized individuals. There's again, those false assumptions are generally due to outdated research and or research that is not done by a particular group. So when you have marginalized groups having research done on them as opposed to with them or by them, you tend to have some research concerns unless there's some really good conversations about inclusivity and analyzing or critically analyzing prior research that has been done. It also has a lot of relying on the judicial system within their research. The judicial system, especially when it talks about any kind of victimization, is going to have numbers that are not accurate because the vast majority of individuals who experience violence do not report it to the justice system in any capacity. So the justice system numbers are automatically going to be significantly lower than what happens in the general population. There's also a disconnect between violence and the cultural norms such as male dominance, rape culture, and religious gender notions. So anytime you talk about domestic violence, there has to be a conversation about toxic masculinity. There has to be a conversation about the way in which we teach who can be violent, who can assert specific power, who can assert specific kinds of is what I'm looking for, feelings, especially when it comes to aggression, things of that nature. It also doesn't really talk or do a good job at any point in this book to talk about rape culture and just the general notion and ways in which how we talk about sexual violence impacts the amount of sexual violence we have in a society. And I have an entire another lecture on rape culture if you are interested to dive more into that. All right. And then again, religious gender notions really is just this idea again that due to religious norms, depending on that, you're going to have a lot more individuals that might stay in domestic violence situations or might have limited options due to an inability to get divorced due to their religious practice or have resources because the religion itself might not really garner access to any kind of resources for these individuals that are in these particular violent settings. Or also, you might have a religious notion who's very geared on covering up things that happen to children or things that happen within family settings as a personal problem and not something that anybody else should get involved in. So again, a reminder that the institutions that we are part of impact our lives and they impact how it is we see the world and what options we see for ourselves. So this book also takes a very white and middle class perspective, including when it talked about families. So just in and of itself, the fact that that traditional family narrative didn't come with the caveat that the large percentage of lower income and marginalized groups were not part of that particular family narrative, in and of itself shows what narrative is being talked about and why. It's also very heteronormative, again, in its perspective, and it has an invisibility of certain marginalized groups and family dynamics. All right. So the Industrial Revolution did do quite a bit of things, as it talks about in your book, for changing the families. And that includes that men left home. You also ended up having several major wars that also impacted men leaving home as well. That impacted how the family dynamics really were and kind of promoted this nuclear family idea as opposed to a generational family. Within a homestead, children became an economic liability. So when you get into industrialized thing, you ended up needing childcare. But if you're in a nuclear family, it became an economic liability for you to have those kids in the same ways, right? So as opposed to, say, in a more agricultural society or a society that is built more on farming and those kinds of subsistence measures, more children meant more hands to do all of the farm work, to do all of the upkeep of that particular, whatever it is, crop or whatever it is, entity that you are working on, even small businesses, etc. However, once you get into the Industrial Revolution, those are just more mouths to feed and more mouths that need washed because they cannot come with you and they're not part of the job particular market. Formal education also massively impact during the Industrial Revolution, because for the groups in which were allowed to be part of formal education, it allowed a multitude of options. And I make that caveat because not everyone was able to get those formal educations. It created a lower birth rate for the obvious reason, for several obvious reasons. There was a different kind of work being done. B, children were, again, that economic liability. And that lower birth rate just also came down to a different style of living. A lot of people moved from rural areas to urban areas. In an urban area, space is limited, and your ability to have the amount of space that it took to have kids, the amount of people you were around, the culture in which was around you was geared towards less towards family dynamic activities and more towards individual or couple activities. All right. It had its loss of function. So, and by that, they mean that for a long time, families were used as this kind of your social network, right? Your social network was your family. It was a very big and intergenerational idea. However, when you're in an industrial revolution, there was a lot of moving, there was a lot of going into big cities, there was a lot of changing who your social support networks were, a lot of changing who your dynamics and social dynamics, how social dynamics played out. It changed women's roles. So again, that's not to say that women weren't still doing the vast majority of domestic labor, but it also provided what he calls the quiet revolution, or the ability for women to go into work settings, including things like secretarial work and things that required some level of skill and development. Again, that is not to say that at this point women were not already working, because a vast majority of marginalized women already were. But it's to say that their options for work changed. And it also, depending on how much income you earned, it could also change the roles of women to be able to allow them to be stay-at-home parents, et cetera, et cetera. There was also a greater equality. I put this massive quality up to some degree. Obviously, we still see a grand amount of inequality in our society, and there was still a grand amount of inequality then. But it did allow for some economic distribution to be more level and to have a much healthier middle class than we do now. And that was just due to the fact that there was a lot more ability to have a job that allowed you the wages that allowed you to be able to step out of socioeconomic hardship. Um, there was more divorce, and that was just because there was a process for that. And as women gained more rights, their rights included the ability to do things like have a bank account, uh, or own property without men. And as those things started to happen, the ability to be financially stable or housing stable or any level of stability for women was much more likely. And so with that power came the ability to leave situations that were not good for them. And the same for men too, right? It also allowed men to get divorced when situations were not good for them as well. And it allowed them the space to not have to necessarily continue to foster particular social settings that would require him to say have an entire generation of his wife's family or etc. Within the household. It created longer lives and more intergenerational ties. And so that was um, really talking about the fact that because grandparents were around longer, or great grandparents even, the more and the longer lives that were happening allowed individuals to have more links to generations behind them in a way that when the lives were shorter, that just wasn't possible. Physically, they weren't there. All right. So for symbolic interactionism, where is my slide on conflict theory? Okay, I will deal with that later. But so for symbolic interactionism, you have the changing symbol of family. Again, what does family look like? What's it supposed to be? Talking about arranged marriage is so really when you talk about love as a symbol and part of marriage, that did not happen again till very recent history. The majority of people around the world were part of arranged marriages because it was about social status and it was about marrying for property, et cetera, et cetera. And because women, to a large extent, were thought of as a way to create more legitimacy to oneself as a specific level of or specific age man and to carry on the genetic line so that they can pass on or whatever their fortunes, their well-being, etc., their name. Love did not become a part of this process until it's in the probably last 100 years for the most part that it became the social norm or became more of a social norm. Again, so arranged marriage, the myths versus reality. So in a wide variety of cultures, still have arranged marriage. They still have some version of this. Sorry. And I want to impose upon you the fact that arranged marriages weren't like this idea that America has about arranged marriages is this idea that it's just two random people that get thrown together. Um, for a wide, for most cultures, um, the families that are talking about arranged marriages have been around each other for extended generations or periods of time at least. And so a lot of these arranged marriages are individuals who have grown up together or individuals who have had some say, right? Whose families go to them and say, hey, we're thinking about this particular person for you. How do you feel about this? Right. And it may not be built on necessarily like a love, but it's not throwing somebody into necessarily a situation that is terrible, right? These are predominantly, and sometimes it is even an arranged marriage for love, right? It's an arranged marriage because they know um, they have grown a large affinity for each other due to the fact that these two have been around each other for an extended period of their life, right? Um, and so I do want to make very clear that what determines an arranged marriage will depend greatly on a particular area, will depend greatly on a particular culture, and it is not just one size fits all. There's also a changing ideas of children. So choosing to be child free or childless, that terminology changes. But trade, depending on who you are. But choosing not to have kids is something that is um, more and more common. And that's just due to the fact that by the time education is completely done, maybe a job, you get stable on a job or economically stable to have kids. At that point, you may not want to. You may have already gotten a lifestyle that you are okay with. Choosing or having to have two incomes also can put a damper on child being able to have children. Infertility, again, we're having children and getting married at a much later age. And then again, marriage is also thought of as unnecessary to have children. So this is not always something that, again, has to come marriage and then children and then this traditional idea of what is going on. There are also changing expectations about parenting, so more involved breadwinners, and so that can be men or women or both. Um, and also that men predominantly are more a part of the household, about the household chores, about the parenting, about that particular that particular notion of more gendered equality. That does not mean it has been achieved. Women are still primarily doing at least twice as much as men when it comes to household, and that is again within heterodynamic households. So when you talk about changing expectations of parenting, you also have to talk about the fact that parenting in LGBTQ plus relationships, through adoption, through um, uh, vitro, through surrogates, etc., as a fairly decent history within the US at this point. And so it has become more of a social norm for those parents to be able to be a part of particular dynamics, such as institutions like schooling and things of that nature. There's changing of marital roles. So what role marriage plays in society is also changing, right? So it's not necessarily about status at this point. It still is in some cases, right, depending on where you are on your socioeconomic ladder. But for the large majority of the US, you have a choice, and it is predominantly thought of to be considered for love. Over here, you have a reasons for marriage and cohabitations, and they differ considerably in some dimensions. And so this is just anybody that is married talking about essentially in the green why they were either getting married or why they chose to cohabitate instead. And so really just talking about how financials were a part of the conversation, and wanting to kind of test out a relationship before marriage to kind of avoid divorce. But for the majority of the time, love and companionship were the number one reasons for either getting married and or for living together with a partner. Down here, I also wanted to talk about the fact that, again, cohabitation has increased pretty dramatically from 2013 to 2017. You have more people cohabitating than they were married, from the age of 18 to 44 who have either been married or cohabitated, and that has changed since 2002. I would guess that those numbers have changed even more since 2003 or 2023, but I do not have that data and could not find data really much more reliable data than the 2019 study that created these graphics. All right. You also have adults saying that it's acceptable for being unmarried and living together, and that because that has increased so dramatically, you have much more freedom to be able to have that option than you did before. And again, society is just as well off if couples who went to stay together long term did not marry, as they do it, or versus people are better off to get married. And that's kind of where the line falls. So it's really 50-50. People are saying that it's okay to not do this, but there's a large majority of people saying, hey, there's still some benefits to getting married, especially legal benefits. So here's why this matters. All right. And then changing ideas of divorce. Divorce has become kind of a social norm in the US. And it's also provided ways to get out of things like violence, has provided ways to get out of toxic situations. And that is actually a really good thing. And then legal changes, including marriage equality, the ages in which you can get married, and justifications for that. And then the major thing is that your book talks about is this family of orientation versus family of procreation. So a family of orientation is essentially the family that you get your names from, your identity, your heritage, your ascribed status. It's the one you're born into. Versus your family procreation is the one that you establish upon marriage or cohabitation. It's the people that you choose. It's the people that you have children with. It's the people you either take or give your name to. It becomes your family of orientation for the next generation, and it grants orientation to kind of adulthood or entering the world. All right. So let's move to functionalism. Again, I really don't know. It's right there. So why is it not on the? I'm not entirely sure where or why the conflict theory page isn't there anymore, but it's still over here. So that's kind of weird. So you can still access it. All right. So within functionalism, up here is talking really about the different ways in which you can now have children due to a wide range of scientific discovery or change in methods. And then again, down here, just for reference sake, is breadwinners and co-breadwinners, and just the rise in which of the share of breadwinning or co-breadwinning mothers has almost doubled since 1967. So being the breadwinner has almost doubled, as well as being a co-breadwinner has almost doubled. And that's due to economic circumstances for the most part. So within economic production, women in the workplace has again significantly increased. Two-income households are almost completely necessary at this point. And economic inequality has created a dynamic where the middle class is shrinking, and thus the need for that two-income household has included far more people than it once did. All right, socialization of children. Family is still primarily the main source of socialization with children, especially at a young age. And so it still provides that function within the society. And it's still something that vastly changes your worldview and your own view of self at that early age and really moving forward. It serves the function of care for the sick and aged. However, that is kind of changing as well, because you have nursing homes and a growing population of those who are aging, which puts in economic strains on families. Recreation, for a long time, there was family-centered events were the predominant options for entertainment. However, we're looking towards more of entertainment as history is shown. Entertainment has gotten to much more of a single or group dynamic, which allows you to have recreation outside of the family. And so that function is no longer necessary for that particular service. So one of the functions of marriage has long-term, and family have long-term been a control of sexuality, religion, and women's sexuality, and or really anybody's sexuality has been geared towards you have sex first. Women are supposed to stop that to make sure that they regulate the sexual deviancy of males, blah, 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 blah. And religion kind of is that cornerstone for which that notion is continued at this point. As for most of the rest of the time, sexuality is really tied to partnership and less so of necessarily marriage. However, that's also changing and has changed during different periods to where sexuality is not necessarily tied to partnership either and can be tied to just pleasure and fun. All right, so LGBTQ plus delegitimization. So marriage was used as this thing that delineated partners that were same sex versus partners that were heteronormative, right? And so because it created a way in which for heteronormative people to be a status above or a status symbol that LGBTQ plus people could not achieve, that with the marriage equality, you do see much more of the LGBTQ plus population being able to become part of that. However, there's still obstacles and hurdles in the way of that, including different state barriers being put up, and or depending on if you are able to get the correct gender markers on your documents or have documents that accurately represent you to begin with. All right, reproduction, you also have 2/5 of the births are of women in the United States are those who are not married. So again, kind of getting at that idea that marriage is no longer necessary for women to have kids. Adoptions and changes in other reproductive measures have also changed the function of reproduction within family and marriage. And that's kind of where this comes in. All right. So again, I'm not sure why that little tag isn't there anymore, but the slide still is, so we'll go with it. So for conflict and feminist theory, we're going to get into a lot more of feminist theory, and that's just because most of what conflict theory talks about is feminist theory within this particular framework of the family. So it talks about family as a social unit, our earliest form of socialization, and often our strongest, and that continues throughout most of the life. It's where we first experience gender, including things like baby decor, reveal parties, and clothing and children, toys for children. So you're geared towards whatever gender you are from before you were even born, for the most part, within the family dynamic. Power within families, and Sean Lee is a book I used for my Women and Gender Studies course. But they talk about power within families being understood as access to resources, tangible and intangible, that allows certain family members to define the reality of others, have their needs met, and access more resources. So really just talking about the ways in which, depending on where you are in your family and how your family operates, you can access more resources and kind of hold those resources over, hold someone else's resources over them. So, right, if depending on that's economic, that can be housing, that can be food, that can be physical and emotional needs, that can be things such as sexual needs, that can be all sorts of different variety of needs. Up here in that notion, you also have just a reminder of some of the red flags as you are dating and or in with long-term relationships in a heteronormative sense or in a non-heteronormative sense, and you have a husband or a partner. This could be really important to kind of talk about essentially what it means to be controlling. All right. Age also has a dynamic within families, because as you are kids, you have less autonomy, less control over your own life. And that's for a variety of reasons and not always a negative, but it is something that determines how much of how much power you have within your own social setting. So when it comes to gendered power, you see that in the day-to-day decisions. You see that especially in heteronormative couples, that generally the men have a higher status and are still allowed to make more of the day-to-day decisions. But again, that depends on what kind of family dynamic you have. Marriage is traditionally where male power over wives, and that's because of a loss of identity or individuality, a loss of one's own name, fathers giving away his daughters, and them being considered a property of source, for a long period of history, and to some degree still now. These ideas wrapped in notions of purity, surrounding this particular topic. And then women with particular engagement rings, where men are only wear them once they are married, determining that correlation between whose is who. And so the women, again, being tied to the man, and being tied to marriage prior to marriage, so that, again, that is tied to both the connection of purity and ownership. However, it can also be we're also seeing the challengings of norms, right? You're seeing a lot more men take women's names or hyphenated names. You're seeing a lot less fathers giving away daughters, or changing the wording in particular. You're seeing a lot more, or a lot less, notions of purity at terms in which marriage happens. And you're seeing a lot more changes in how engagement rings function, or who gets to propose functions, as well as, once you get out of heteronormative relationships, you're going to see a lot more um, changes or challenging of particular social dynamics. But you're also going to see some of those same kind of dynamics. Who's giving away the bride? Who gets to be the bride? Who gets to be the one standing there? Are they both going to walk down the aisle? Is there not a bride at all? And there's two grooms, and what does that look like? And all of those kind of different plays on different marriage ceremonies, and how marriages dynamics play out in general, are really challenging the norms of, and the presumptions behind those norms as we move through modern day. Again, conflict theory and feminist theory talks a lot about income and economic inequality and power. And it talks a lot about how its necessity for two income households has changed family dynamics. Sexism and interpersonal power imbalance can lead to violence. That imbalance in opportunities or responsibilities for girl children, meaning that they end up doing far more of the housework and help. It also is the head complement and junior partner, or junior partner and senior partner dynamic, or equal partner. So you have this like range of different dynamics that happen between the partnerships. So you can have this, like, one is essentially the head of the household and one's kind of the complement to that. You can have essentially partnerships, but that partnership's not necessarily being equal and balanced, and having that junior senior partner. Or you can have equal partnerships within the marriage dynamics in general. And that kind of just depends on cultural settings, depends on the personal choices of the partners, and depends on a lot of other varying social factors. Equal partnerships are relatively infrequent, and men are socialized to expect privileges and unequal distribution within marriages. Family can also be, it's not always a bad thing, right? It can be a source of empowerment. Also, within your partnerships and forming your own family can be a source of empowerment, and can be a way to break cycles of toxicity, or disengage with family, biological family that has done harm. So family can also be a really powerful thing, and a powerful support system, even in non-heterodynamic situations. So like this one, where the mom is between the two women who are getting married, and really showing a wide variety of support for them and their happiness. All right, so we have done theory. I am going to go ahead and pause here because I hear little footsteps coming down the hallway. And so I want to make sure they don't interrupt. And I will get back to these as soon as I can get little humans quiet enough to do so. All right, I will talk to you guys soon. I hope you guys are enjoying these lectures, and really enjoying talking about all these different changes in family dynamics. All right.